Welcome to our first event of this academic year, to the Roman Family Center for Decision Research, first Think Better session for this academic year. Delighted to have so many of you here with us in person. Also delighted to have so many folks joining us from Zoom. We have at least 1,200 folks registered to attend there tonight. So behind that camera are lots of different faces we can say hello to. The purpose of this series is to try to bring insights from behavioral science here in front of a more public-facing audience to talk about how the research that we do in our research laboratories and out in the field might affect policy, might affect day-to-day life, might affect stuff that we care about in our everyday lives. This is one of the many things that the Roman Family Center for Decision Research does to try to benefit behavioral science research here. In addition to this talk series, we also run MindWorks, which is down Michigan Avenue, a few blocks. If you haven't been, please go and attend. It's fun, and you'll pick up some swag. As adept as I think the Roman Family Center for Decision Research is at helping behavioral scientists conduct research, I have to say that my heart would skip a beat if we had to support the research of Betsy Levy Paluck, our researcher tonight. She deserves a center entirely on her own, I think, because the research that she does is among the hardest stuff that behavioral scientists ever do. She doesn't do research in the lab very often. She does it out there in the world, and not in easy places to do research in the world, in hard places. She's in Rwanda and Uganda and in China and New Jersey, 52 middle schools in New Jersey, which is the hardest and most dangerous, she said, field assignment that she has ever been on. What makes Betsy's research unique and deserving of a Genius Award, a MacArthur Fellowship, which she did a few years ago, is she has unique insight into the importance of understanding the psychological processes that are operating on the ground if you're going to understand how different kinds of interventions are going to be there, affect people who are out there in the world. Interventions or things that influence human behavior aren't plug and play, aren't simple. If you do this, then that will happen. You have to understand something deep and fundamental about the people who you are intervening on. You have to understand their psychology if you are going to understand how they are affected wisely. And so Betsy has done things like tried to figure out understands how to intervene on people. You have to know what the belief system is in some place where behavior is being affected to understand how to change behavior. So she went to China, half a dozen garment factories there, trying to help the management figure out how to help folks there litter less on the floors. And what she did was she put stickers of gold coins on the floor. That doesn't make any sense unless you understand that folks living there really believe that these coins are omens of good fortune in the future, and you wouldn't want to throw trash upon them. And that had a very powerful effect on reducing people's propensity to litter in that environment. But that's not going to work here, right? Because there's a different psychology at work here. Or at least I doubt it's going to work here. She also understands who to intervene on. This is where she went to the middle schools in New Jersey and realized if you're going to try to reduce conflict and intergroup prejudice and some of the animosity that you see in middle schools that make middle school the worst years of our lives, she understands that you got to know who to intervene on. Who is it that's influencing who in that environment? It turns out there are influencers there, people at the middle of social networks. So she went to 52 different middle schools and mapped out the social networks of these places and then targeted the seeds. She called them the social influencers at the center of these social networks in order to affect and to reduce conflict dramatically, 30% reduction in reported conflict in these middle schools because she understands who to intervene on. But you also have to understand what to intervene on if you're going to understand how influence happens. And so when she went to Rwanda to look at how to reduce intergroup prejudice, what she intervened on was the place where most folks got their news at the time, and that was a soap opera on the radio, a telenovela that she studied the impact of this radio program, essentially this radio soap opera that was presenting kind of pro-social values and encouraging a reduction in intergroup conflict to understand, to see big effects on a reduction in intergroup conflict there. There's a wisdom in Betsy's research that's rare in the field, which again is what made her so clearly deserving of the MacArthur Genius Award grant that she got in 2017. She's a professor of psychology and public policy at Princeton, and she does have a center, as far as I can tell, that is mainly for her. She's the director of the Kahneman and Treisman Center there at Princeton. So I'm super grateful that she was willing to come and give us a presentation tonight to tell us about who influences us out there in the world. Thank you so much for coming, Betsy.
Thank you so much, Nick. You just basically gave my talk for me, describing, so we can all just go have another glass of wine and talk to each other now. There is just such a concentration of people in Chicago who I admire and who I like. And so getting an invitation to talk here feels like both an honor and a delight. And so thank you so much for having me. And so when I was thinking about what to talk about today, I thought that maybe a lesson that I can cull from a lot of the research that I've been doing and the research that others in behavioral science has been doing can be summarized by some answers to this question of who influences us. And by us, I mean society, like the big us. And I think that when you reflect on that question, many of us would think about the big influences, right? So media propaganda, politicians, religion, courts, celebrity, right? And I think that my answer to that, and the answer of many behavioral scientists, would be yes, undoubtedly. Like all of those really big influences do change things in our society, like patterns of violence, patterns of voting, where we invest our money, how we treat one another. But I think that what I'm trying to do in my work and what I want to communicate today and try to convince you today is that we need to go beyond just the yes, it influences us, to ask how are these things influencing us? And there's a step in between these big influences and then what we do as a society that I really want to pay attention to. There are some people in that step who I think go unappreciated when we think about influence. And my contention is that we really understand that process of influence, we're better able to harness it. And for the projects that we have on reducing violence, on reducing prejudice, on changing patterns of behavior that we really care about, that's what we would really need to know about. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. I'm going to focus a lot in this talk on reducing violence. That's something that I've focused a lot on in my career. But I'm going to talk about some other things as well. And because I'm focusing so much on one particular type of dependent variable, on violence, I'll try to give you a lot of different examples of different kinds of influences on violence to give you a sense of why I think that this could apply to a lot of different things, a lot of the projects that you think about. I'm going to be talking about the US Supreme Court. I'll talk about radio soap operas. I'll talk about peer influence. And yes, I'm going to talk about Taylor Swift. Because contractually, as a behavioral scientist studying influence these days, I've been informed that I now need to talk about Taylor Swift. So we're going to do all of that. And I'm going to talk about this in 3 parts. Okay, so the first part, what I really want to do is give you the intuition for what I'm talking about. I want to motivate these ideas with some examples and a little bit of data. In part 2, I want to go deeper into the research and some research that we actually just published the other day, and go a little bit deeper into my story about who are these people who are influencing us, who are channeling the influence of the big forces like media and religion and so forth. And then finally, in part 3, I want to talk about, like, okay, now if we know this, what do we do? How could we use this to design interventions? So part 1, I'm actually going to start with a serious story. I want to talk about Rwanda. This is a picture of beautiful Rwanda. It's called the Land of a Thousand Hills, and you can see why. The whole country looks like this, with varying colors across the landscape. And I want to talk specifically, though, about the Rwandan genocide of 1994. So in the words of Human Rights Watch, this was really one of the defining events of the 20th century, right? So this was the event that taught us that we had not eradicated the evils of genocide following the Holocaust. We had not learned our lessons about how to stop that. It really ended that illusion. And so what happened in Rwanda was, over the course of only 13 weeks, more than 500,000 ethnic Tutsi were killed, which is about 70 to 75% of the entire Tutsi population. Most of this violence was face-to-face violence. It was neighbor on neighbor. Sometimes it was within interethnic families. And along the way, the Hutu militia and neighbors who were doing this killing also killed thousands of Hutus who tried to stand between the killers and their Tutsi neighbors and family members, and those Hutu who were moderate and were calling out against this violence. The killing was called for by the elite set of Hutus who were trying to remain in power. And in a parallel with the Holocaust, in some ways even exceeding it, was this example of how the media participated in and directed and encouraged this killing. And because the majority of people in Rwanda got their news through radio, the media propaganda came through one particular radio station, as well as the state-run radio station. And this was the radio station RTLM. You have pictured here one of the founders of RTLM. This radio station actually started out as a really entertaining station. It had the latest music, the most entertaining DJs and banter, and yes, they wove in crude ethnic jokes and some screeds about Hutu identity. But once the genocide started, it began broadcasting things, passages, horrific passages like I've printed up here. So I want to personally congratulate the hardworking Hutus of Kibuye for their excellent work. More of our Tutsi enemies have been killed in Kibuye than any other province. They end off by saying, but we must kill them all, let's finish the job, okay? This is influence. And one reason why I can say this so definitively is this is one source of media influence that was actually convicted officially by an international criminal tribunal. So this is the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda. When the genocide had ended, the judges heard testimonies from expert witnesses saying that what they heard from people inside the country at this time is, if you want to stop this violence, stop RTLM. You jam the radio stations. Everyone is listening. Everyone is taking orders from this radio station. The judges heard the evidence, and they concluded, without a firearm, machete, or any physical weapon, these were the weapons of killing during the genocide, the radio station caused the death of thousands of innocent civilians. Okay? So the judgment of this tribunal was that the radio program had essentially been like a hypodermic needle, that it had poisoned the hearts and minds of the Hutu population and encouraged them to go out and kill. And this is actually the kind of model that other courts have used to convict media propagandists. This idea, this model that propaganda and these big influences can really just change our hearts and minds and thus our behavior. A behavioral science perspective would say something different. Now, we would not try to acquit this radio station. I still agree that it caused the death of thousands of civilians. But the question is really here, how did it change everyone's behavior? How did it motivate these killings? Okay? And what we would contend is that a simple model of the hypodermic needle is not the full story of influence. But instead, media influence is really channeled socially. So you might remember from the quote that I gave you, sometimes media contains social cues within it. So that DJ who I quoted was saying, the people of Kibuye are doing their work. You're learning something about other people by listening to this radio station. But there's something else that goes on when we consume media. In this picture, here's a boy listening to a radio and other people gathered around. This is the most common way to listen to the radio in sub-Saharan Africa. You listen collectively. And so what you're doing when you're taking in media messages is you're not just taking in the information, you're not just reacting with your own personal emotions and reasoning about the things that are being said on the radio, you're also watching the reactions of everyone else around you. Okay? But let me put some data on this. So remember how I told you that Rwanda is the land of 1,000 hills, yeah? So one implication of that is that radio transmitters, when they're broadcasting out in a certain direction, will hit some hills in a particular way, such that not everybody receives the radio transmission in a particular community. If you're living on the other side of that hill, this is a picture that I took in Kigali, the capital, then some of your neighbors might not actually be able to receive the radio signal as well. Okay, so what a very clever economist did was gather data on killings during the genocide and match those up with what proportion of people in your community were able to receive the radio signal during the genocide. Okay, and this is the figure that they produced. And what I want you to see here is that the amount of killing, the amount of violence is on the y-axis as you rise. There are different lines in the graph. And the lines are following out with the proportion of your community that had access to the radio program, to the radio RTLM during the genocide. Now, if the hypodermic needle influence model is correct, you should see that more people receive this radio station, you should just see the individual levels of violence go up, right? Because that's just simple math. More people in the community are getting the message, so more people are participating in the violence. But that's not what you see. That holds steady. Instead, what you see is there's something more social going on. So as more people in the community receive the signal, the collective violence, which is, by the way that most people were killed during the genocide, goes exponentially up, right? So there's something about not just knowing about it yourself, there's something about knowing that others know. The media is coordinating people. It's a more collective signal, okay? Let me give you another intuition for this. This is a video that I took. This was 10 years following the genocide. And this is at the occasion of a live performance of a very different kind of radio program. As a graduate student, I was studying, as Nick mentioned, the effects of a peace-building radio soap opera that had been written and broadcast 10 years following the genocide. And it became so popular. This was actually in the year following my dissertation, so I was still doing research with this radio organization. It was such a hit that they started doing live performances all over the countryside. They would announce it the morning of and just say, we're going to show up at the stadium, we're going to do a live performance of some of the scenes from our show. And this is what happened when they would do this. So let me just play this for you. So this is another way we consume media, right? This is probably the most blatant demonstration of how we watch media, but we also watch other people watching it, right? And as I panned across the audience, you can kind of still see the man there. You can see that some people aren't even waiting to discuss the performance with their friends in the audience. Some people are turning to others in the audience as the performance is ongoing, right? Something you might even do tonight as you're sitting next to a friend and you say, what is she talking about? So this is another way in which we should think about media influence. It's the influence from the people who watch with us. Or maybe it's the influence from the people who talk about the show with us the day after. We both know we've watched it. Okay? And that's the thing about a hit, is that you know that a lot of people out there in the country are watching the show. I'm going to return to this in a minute. But I give you that intuition as well. And then finally, let me give you one more intuition from a very different place, because you might be thinking to yourself, we don't live in this kind of society, Betsy. You know, we don't sit around the television together anymore even. Like, we're all just watching on our phones. We're all so atomized. Like, we are not affected this way socially. So I want to go to another great influencer of our time, Ms. Taylor Allison Swift. You might have heard that she had showed up to a few NFL football games recently. And everybody has been making much of the Taylor Swift effect on the NFL, right? And so these are not my data. I'm not really sure what this metric is, but what this is showing here is that every time she shows up at the game, this is the boost that the NFL gets in terms of social media recognition. And it seems like it's going beyond that. It seems like the NFL is enjoying some spending boosts, and Mr. Travis Kelce is, in particular, enjoying some extra money as people buy his jerseys more often. So this is another example of influence, right? And an influencer, of a celebrity just coming in and telling us where to look, what to buy, who to get excited about, right? But I'm also interested in this, okay? I'm interested in this video from TikTok, and there are a lot of them like this, but here's one. So why are we doing this? It's not enough just to open up Instagram and have it flooded with videos of Taylor Swift at the game. I also see videos of other people screaming, watching Taylor Swift at the game, right? What I want to tell you is that there's just something so fundamentally human about this, right? Something happens, and we look to others to make sense of it, right? Something happens, Taylor Swift shows up at a game, we don't just reason through it and decide we're gonna go out and buy a jersey and, you know, this is how we feel. We look to see what other people are saying, and that can amplify the effect, right? Okay, and so that's the intuition here. Once we start knowing something about these dynamics, what can we do about it? And one of the reasons that I got so excited about these kinds of dynamics is, as I mentioned, because I went to Rwanda as a graduate student, and I was just really fascinated by whether media could be used for the opposite purposes in Rwanda. And this particular NGO had decided the same. Their goal was to really teach people in Rwanda, using this narrative format, about violence. How does it grow? How can it be stopped? There were themes of interethnic marriage, so the whole soap opera was actually built around a Romeo and Juliet story. So one woman from one hill, we weren't allowed to mention Hutu and Tutsi at the time, even the language had been outlawed in Rwanda. But there's one woman from one hill and a boy from the other hill, and instead of falling to their untimely death, they form a youth peace movement. And they try to prevent violence from happening in their community. They fight back against the authorities who are trying to divide the population. So the whole idea was that this would actually be kind of an educational show. And what I did was I was there at the very inception before a lot of people were watching this. So as it was written, we rolled it out randomly to different listeners in different communities, and we compared that to other communities where we rolled out a different radio soap opera. This one was about women's health. It was just about different themes. And this is a very common thing to have educational messages built into soap operas. By the way, we do this here in the US too. This was a very important part of AIDS communication in the 80s. It's done all over the world. This isn't special to Rwanda per se. What I found at the end of a whole year of listening to either the reconciliation program versus this women's health program was a positive effect on people's behavior. So we also found a behavioral effect of the radio. We found that people were more likely to share resources that we gave to interethnic settings. We found that they were more likely to dissent with one another in a place where dissent felt dangerous, and that was one of the reasons why the creators of the show wanted to promote dissent, because we didn't see a lot of this during the genocide against authorities who were calling for violence. But here's the thing that really concerned the creators of the radio program, but just fascinated me, was that we didn't see any attitude change. So this quote up here really illustrates it. So we would have these listeners saying, I don't really believe that interethnic marriage prevents violence. And why would I? I just watched a Hutu man kill his Tutsi wife not but a decade ago. You're not going to convince me of that. But I believe that other Rwandans think that this is the way forward. And so for me as a scholar, this was, my first look at this kind of social effect of the media, whereby this wasn't a hit show to the extent that everybody was gathering in stadiums to see the live plays yet, but the listeners in our study really loved the show. And when they gathered together, they could see how one another appreciated it. And so this lent this impression to them that, okay, maybe I don't fully buy it myself, but that's the way our society is going. Everybody's getting on board with this message, okay? And the important thing to me was that we also saw these behavioral effects. And so I'm a pragmatist. What is gonna change people's behavior? So who influences us? Well, of course, media, celebrity, government, or religious institutions. I'm not here to say that I have this magic trick that subverts any of these massive influences on us. But how do they influence us? That's the other major question here. And what I'm going to argue for the rest of this talk is that the influence of these really large public forces are really channeled through our observations of how other people react to them. Right? These big things happen, and we look to others in our communities to make sense of it, okay? What do they mean? Are we all on board? These are the kinds of questions we ask when we look at our neighbor, right? After something happens. And it really reminded me of something I had read as a graduate student early on. This is from research back in the 20s as people were starting to study the effects of radio and television. And the lesson from those was that media doesn't tell us what to think, it tells us what other people are thinking, right? And this is a really special kind of influence. If you can get people to change their mind about what others are thinking, I'm gonna contend that that might even be more important than if you had some kind of needle that could change hearts and minds, right? It's really telling us what is the new normal. What are the standards, right, that our community, our society lives by? What are the social rules that you have to stay within, right? So I think that, when we seek to make sense of what's typical, of what's desirable, that's why these big events are so meaningful, because it draws everybody's attention, and then we look around, okay? All right, so part 2. So that's the intuition. I told you a story. I have a dissertation. Okay, so what? Let's see if this travels any farther. And where I'd like to take you next is to the Supreme Court. Okay, so I want to take you back to 2015. And if you remember 2015, this was a time when the Supreme Court justices, there were some different people on the court then, were considering Obergefell v. Hodges. This was the case that was questioning whether same-sex marriage should be legalized, okay? And I hope it's not a spoiler, they legalized it, okay? And the American public at the time was getting ready for that, right? So here's public opinion in the US at that time. A majority of Americans, 57%, according to this Pew poll, favored same-sex marriage being legal. And that's a steep climb from just a decade previous, right? So society was really changing, and I can show it to you for Democrats and independents and Republicans. So it's not that everybody in the US at this point agreed on whether same-sex marriage should be legal, but everybody was moving in a very similar and very steep direction. And so what Margaret Tankard and I asked one another at that time, my graduate student, was, well, when the court rules, will it influence us? Will it build on this momentum? Will it change people's minds further? Or thinking what we thought about norm perceptions at the time, will the Supreme Court decision tell us where American society is going? Will it tell us something about what other people think? And so what we did was a very simple design. I hope it's really going to be quick to understand. We basically got a huge group of people, about 1,600 people, and we just kept asking them the same questions across time. Before the court had made its decision, we asked them personally, to what extent do you oppose or support gay marriage? And then we asked them the norm perception. To what extent do you think Americans oppose or support same-sex marriage, gay marriage? And so here's the design. We started in March of 2015. And we gathered a large sample, so we're collecting a lot of data. And then we knew that the Supreme Court was going to announce their decision sometime in June, okay? So as soon as June arrived, we started asking more frequently. And the idea is, will we see any kind of discontinuity, a jump in public opinion around that time? And so the Supreme Court ended up announcing that decision on June 26th, I believe. And so the question is, what would the data look like in terms of personal opinions and in your perceptions of what other people in America thought at the time? Does anyone remember the day that the decision was announced? I see a lot of heads nodding. Do you remember things like this? Do you remember this? So, while clearly, as I showed you from the public opinion, not everybody was celebrating on that day, there were celebrations, and they were very colorful, they were very vivid. There were pictures, I'm showing you one from the New York Times, one from the Kansas City Star, just all over the newspapers, of longtime partners rushing to the courthouse and in front of cheering family and friends and strangers getting married, right? And so what we saw was this. We saw a big discontinuity. And if you will allow me, I really want to tell you how big this is, because I know it doesn't look very impressive. But these are people's opinions about what other people think in the United States. And this jump, right, the day after the decision is announced, it's 2 times the size of the change of baby boomers' change in opinion toward same-sex marriage over the last decade. So public opinion-wise, that's a really large jump, and it happened literally overnight, okay? Now I want you to compare that to people's own opinions. No change. The Supreme Court did not tell you what to think, but maybe it told you what other Americans were thinking, okay? But in this study, and I want to show you, while there were great differences between people who told us that they were conservative and people who told us they were liberal in terms of their personal opinions toward same-sex marriage, we find the same jump, the same discontinuity among both groups, which I find to be really important, okay? So there's not something ideological going on here. There's something about how you're seeing your society, right? So here's the thing. At the time we published this, we described the effect as one that was affected by the Supreme Court, because we really can't pull them apart. We can't say, well, it was definitely the Supreme Court that did this, because at the same time as the Supreme Court announced, we got this, right? All this social feedback about how excited and joyful Americans were, right? And you might have more or less exposure to this, fine, right? And we see variance in our survey. But we couldn't really say, was this the court or was it the way we turned to one another at that moment and said, well, how do you feel about this, right? Do you feel rainbow? So what we did, what we've actually just published yesterday or the day before, is a follow-up study. We used the same methodology to study Dobbs, right? But you know Dobbs as Roe, right? So this was the case that was decided last year that overturned the precedent set by Roe v. Wade, the taking away of abortion as enshrined as a constitutional right, okay? And so what was interesting to us about this case is now this was a case where everyone predicted, we expected, the court to go against what we now knew as a slight majority opinion in the US. So we didn't know what would happen with the case, but even though you can move this around by asking about abortion in different ways, absolutely, reliably, what polls were showing right around the time before the decision was that a slight majority of Americans supported some kind of legal access to abortion. Okay, but we expected that the court would go the other way, and in fact it did. Right? So here's how they covered it in Los Angeles, in New Orleans, in Washington. Okay, but these were the headlines everywhere. A little detail that you might remember, we actually got 2 Supreme Court announcements last year. So at first this decision was leaked to the public, and then it was announced officially. So really causing my graduate student who is leading this effort, Chelsea Clark, just the most heartburn of her life. You know, you, as an advisor, you say, don't worry, the sun will come up, the Supreme Court will announce, and then suddenly the Supreme Court announces before we have fielded the survey. But we managed to salvage the study, first because we had been asking about people about abortion in a sample of about 3,000 people for a very long time. So we managed to catch some of them before the leak. But here's the really interesting thing. These are people's perceived norms of whether other Americans support abortion. And now they go against the court, right? So the court rules that abortion should not be a right enshrined by the Constitution, and then people think more Americans support abortion, okay? So it increases by 4.1 percentage points when it's leaked, and then we found in that data set, a non-representative data set of about 3,000 people, that it holds steady when it's announced, okay? The website 538 reported on our data at the time and of course produced a way nicer figure. This is another way to look at it. If you just break it down into who's strongly agreeing that Americans support legal access to abortion, you see that just jumps way up after the leak, okay? But we were also able to join with another research team who had data on the Supreme Court, and so we quickly, all together, mounted another survey, and we surveyed people right after the leak. Now this is about 5,400 people, and this is a representative survey of all Americans. And we see that even from after the leak to after the ruling, people once again rise in their estimation of how much Americans support legalized access to abortion. So this is 2.4 percentage points in one panel sample and 2 percentage points in a cross-sectional sample, asking different people at different times, okay? So it's really consistent. And what we know about American reactions to this decision was that there were also people in the streets, but this time they weren't clapping. There weren't rainbows. There were a lot of counter-protests, right? So if you looked around at that time, you could see ample evidence that Americans, some Americans, were unhappy about this decision. And so we tried to dig into that a little bit more to see, well, is this a plausible story? Is this a story that this big thing happens and you look around and you say, wow, no, I think Americans don't really support this decision, and they do support legalized access. So we dug into the social media environment at the time to see what that looked like. So we went to Twitter. And first of all, we just went to see how much are people posting about abortion. These numbers are ridiculous. I don't know if you can read them all the way in the back. But this is something like 78 billion engagements. This is Twitter, so it counts everything. It counts whether you saw, a mention of abortion, or you liked it, or you retweeted everything. It counts everything. So just to give you a sense of scale, it's similar to the scale of the January 6th insurrection. That's how much attention abortion got, right? The abortion decision got. Then we could take all the text of every single tweet that mentioned abortion, and we could run it through a program that tells us whether the emotion and the judgmental language of that text, of that tweet, was positive or negative. And what we found was that the majority of the tweets about the abortion decision were negative. We also knew that there were a lot of news reports at the time following the leak, showing this data that the majority of Americans believe abortion should be legal. So we said, well, how often are those getting shared? And we can see that after the ruling, this spikes to just millions of shares. And all of these polls did show, it did essentially provide that normative information, right? And again, we analyzed the language in those tweets, and we found that it was mostly negative. Okay, so the idea here was that what we think is going on is that we do this sense-making after events, we look to see what others think, and we think that the Supreme Court certainly has a direct effect on how we're thinking about things, but what we're really seeing happen is that the Supreme Court rulings are these events that make us look around and listen to what other people think. And that really shapes our opinions or our perceptions of what's normative, okay? Okay, so part 3. If this is true, then what do we do with it, right? So first of all, I just want to ask, what does it matter what you think other Americans think? And what does it matter what you think other people in your community think? Is this important for behavior, as I suggested in part 1? And secondly, if you know all of this, then how would you use it? And how would you use it in an everyday sense? Because, you know, many of us probably have projects where we want to change people's patterns of behavior, maybe improve patterns of behavior, reduce violence, improve tolerance in our communities, lots of other things, sell stuff. But, you know, we don't really have Taylor Swift on call to help us do that, or we can't get the Supreme Court to make an announcement for us. So, you know, what is the everyday sense-making that we do? How do we understand that everyday sense-making? And so I'm going to return to a project that was about violence, and it was about violence reduction. This is a schools-based project that we did that Nick also generously mentioned. This was a project that followed up on, I'm sorry again for another serious and sad story, a tragic case in New Jersey where I live and work, where a Rutgers University student, Tyler Crumlenti, took his own life after he was bullied. And what this did in my state was that it created the political will and a mandate for all schools to have anti-bullying and anti-harassment programming in it, middle school, high school, universities, state universities. And so what do you do in that situation, right? And I can tell you, because I watched it roll out in all of the schools, and the instinct that people have in these cases is typically to instruct. You know, we gotta tell students how bad this is, you know, or maybe to do a kind of scared straight kind of program where you get somebody on stage and tell them about the horrible effects of bullying and the emotional toll, right? So a lot of these kinds of assemblies happened in the year following Tyler's tragic death. But what we wanted to think about instead was the norms of these schools. Where do students get their ideas about what's typical and what's desirable in terms of how to interact with each other and how to treat each other, right? How are those norm perceptions shaped? And in an everyday way, right? And so what our research and the research of other behavioral scientists led us to believe is that when you try to figure out what's the norm of this room, right, or what's the norm of my school, you don't look around and just take an unweighted average. Like, I think the average behavior in this school is X, and I should stay close to that. No, you're embedded in a social network. You pay attention to particular people. That's the contention here. So certain people are looking at others in this network of students. And that's precisely what we did to test it out. We went into a high school and we built a network of attention, right? This isn't a social network online. This is a network that we built by having everyone sit down at the same time and tell us, who did you choose to spend time with last week, either face-to-face or online, okay? And all of the circles that you see on this figure are students. What you'll note is that some are colored gray and some are colored yellow. The ones that are colored yellow are the ones that got the most nominations as someone who other people are choosing to pay attention to, choosing to spend time with. And if you zoomed in on this graph, what you'd find is that some of the yellow dots look like this young person on the left, someone we call a widely known person. They're nominated by so many people that all the people nominating them don't even know each other, right? Or you could be someone, and those people we often think of as popular, but they don't have to be liked to be widely known, okay? As you might know from personal experience. And the person on the right is someone we call a clique leader, someone who's nominated, getting a lot of attention from all the same people who know one another. And I think what's really interesting about the people who get highlighted in this network of attention is that not all of them are popular, and not all of them are even high status. So in a school, there are lots of cliques of people where one person is very important to that clique, but they might be, the chess club that, doesn't have a lot of nominations for homecoming king or queen, right? And so this kind of finding of people who are getting a lot of attention is a different process from the one that is usually used at schools, where you nominate peers as, peer influencers, the ambassadors, right? People who get nominated either by teachers or by their fellow students. So what we did in this project was we worked with a random selection of the widely known and the clique leader students. And we did a program with them in conjunction with the Anti-Defamation League, where it was those students who got up on the stage in front of their peers. And it was those students who made the posters around the school and who decided what they thought was important to change about the way they treated one another. And so what we found in this study with Hannah Shepard was that after a whole year of this, it was the people who were connected, who were paying attention to the ones who had participated in our program. Those were the people who teachers were less likely to nominate as kids who were contributing to a negative environment. The teachers were more likely to say, oh, it's these students, the ones connected to them, who stand up for others. And then when we looked at the records in the vice principal's office, we found that it's the students who were paying attention to the ones, the influentials who we intervened with. It was those students who were less likely to get in trouble for peer conflict, okay? And here's a special thing that I think really sealed it for me that we did in this study is we said, well, is it just that we found these super charismatic people and that's what this network of attention does? These are just the really great people who attract anybody's attention. So what we did is we built a second social network in the school. We got all of the seating assignments from the school. So now I know if this person in this clique is assigned to sit next to that widely known person in homeroom. Does this person now get influenced? Are their norms and are their behaviors influenced by that person? And the answer was no. So what it is, it's a combination of things. It's not just that, oh, this person has charisma and is the leader of this group and you can just activate them and send them out to change the school. It's the sense-making part, remember? Because these networks were about attention. These are students who are choosing to look at each other, right? So I need to wrap up soon, so I'm not going to tell you about the study that we did to really scale this up, but it's just to say that we've done this now across many middle schools with many thousands, tens of thousands of students, and what we find is that there is something special about certain people. They're leaders, they're charismatic, and they have a lot of power over what you think is normal and typical in your school. But what matters is that you're connected to them. You're paying attention to them, right? You're trying to make sense of the school by looking at those people. Okay, so let me skip to the last study of part 3. And this last study, again, has to do with violence, and again, with a very different kind of violence. This is about violence in the home. And the question that I want to address in this study is, again, now that you know this, right, that we try to make sense of our communities by looking around and deciding what we think is typical and desirable, then who are the people who you would choose to carry a message, for example, about domestic violence or intimate partner violence? So we're going to go back again to Africa. And we did this study in Uganda. Now, intimate partner violence, so not violence against any children in the home. Now we're just talking about couples in the home. So intimate partner violence in Uganda is very high. And half of all women in Uganda have experienced some form of intimate partner violence across their lifetimes. But I want you to know we didn't go to Uganda because Uganda is just so bad and so much worse than the rest of us. Globally, all women, including women identifying people in this room, a third of them experience intimate partner violence across their lifetimes on average. And this spikes during periods of crisis, like the COVID pandemic that we just went through. Instead, we went to Uganda because there were some really interesting people there who were working on intimate partner violence, and they had grants, and one of the things they said to us is, what would a behavioral scientist do with anti-intimate partner violence programming? What are some innovative ideas out of behavioral science? Because we keep doing the same kinds of things to try to reduce this in communities like this one. We try to scare people with really stringent laws. We try to let them know that their neighbors disapprove. We have people bang pots when they hear violence going on next door, right? And that's a really interesting one because I thought, oh, wow, that's a really great way to show people, oh, others in your community don't like this. But it also kind of reminded me of being assigned to sit next to someone in a homeroom. Maybe that's not the person who you care about. Maybe that's not the person who you look toward to make sense of things, of what we approve of. So instead, what we thought about in terms of who can influence intimate partner violence in Uganda, we thought about the fact that 80% of all people in Uganda report going to church on a regular basis. So Christianity is the dominant religion. And that 86% of all Ugandans report that religion is a really important force in their lives. And because of this, a lot of couples, when they're having trouble, will go to their pastor. And so pastors really play this sense-making role for couples when they're having trouble. And I think that there's been a lot of reluctance to work with the church for reasons of a lot of people in the intimate partner violence movement worrying that pastors might put the sanctity of marriage above the safety of people in the relationship. But what we saw was an opportunity, right? So if this is the case, if people are going to their pastors, and it's so built into the religious institution there to do so, so the two top ways that the church makes money in Uganda, and in many other places, by the way, can you guess the two top ways the church makes money? Not through donations. Weddings and premarital counseling, okay? So they're doing this. It's like the professor who's been teaching intro psychology all these years. They have the same syllabus. And what we did is we came along and said, well, we have a new syllabus. Would you like to try it out? We've tested it out with all of these pastors in Uganda. And basically, what we did as a team was we went to a lot of pastors and we said, what if the premarital counseling looked like a lot of skill building? We didn't even mention violence. We said, what if you focused a little bit more on breathing through a conflict, taking time before you continue speaking harshly to each other, so using a lot of lessons from cognitive behavioral therapy. What if it was more about teaching people how to share responsibility in financial decision-making? What if it was teaching people about pleasure and about being respectful during sexual relations? So we didn't go in with any kind of punitive language about violence, about sexual consent, or anything like that. And what the team did was go to a lot of pastors and say, what do these lessons sound like to you? And the pastors put it into biblical language. They said, yeah, the Bible talks about this. I could see how the Bible would really be a very nice way to talk about breathing through conflict and taking a pause and speaking kindly to one another. And building this together, what we essentially ended up with was this program called Becoming One. And we had 1,600 couples who signed up for premarital counseling as a regular course of action. And usually that costs money, as I mentioned. And so we offered this programming in partnership with the pastors for free. And so some, in order to have this programming for free, went through it for the first year, and the others were on a waiting list, and they went through it for free the second year. And so that was randomly assigned, and so this was our randomized controlled trial to figure out, does this actually reduce violence? If you work with these influential people to whom the population looks to make sense of conflict in their families, okay? This is one of the pastors working with couples who had kind of a graduation ceremony at the end. And these are the outcomes. So what you see is 2 different bars. We measured violence in the couple with women in the couple. We asked them to self-report any violence that had been happening to them at the 6-month mark after they finished the program and 1 whole year after they finished the program. And what we found was not at the 6-month mark, but after a whole year, a 5 percentage point reduction in reported violence, adjusted from the baseline before they came into this program. An increase in how much they reported having more control and decision-making in their couple. We didn't see significant increases in sexual consent, but we also saw, but we did see significant increases in communication and conflict resolution, all things that were being communicated in this premarital counseling program. Okay, so I want to wrap up and save some time to talk about all of these ideas, but to return to the central theme, we are influenced by very powerful forces in our society. But what I want you to take away from this talk is that we're not powerless in the face of them. In fact, these sources are getting channeled through us, through all of the people around us, and they're people who I think we really underappreciate when we think about being influenced, and when we feel helpless in front of these really sometimes radicalizing and very powerful sources of influence. And so what you should ask, using the behavioral science perspective, is who do you pay attention to? Who are other people paying attention to? Who are you motivated to look toward when you try to make sense of what's going on in the world? Because if you can intervene in this sense-making process, this is an extremely powerful way of changing what people think of as the norm, as what's typical, as what's desirable. And this special kind of influence, we think, can really shape people's behavior as they try to get along with the social standards of their group, and potentially down the line, their own hearts and minds. Maybe that's the research we'll keep going and keep pursuing within the long term. But maybe I'll stop there and we can have a chat.
Thank you so much, Betsy. We have time for a few questions. We want to start with a question from the Zoom audience. Chris?
Yeah, so we're going to start with a question from Abby on Zoom. Thanks very much for tuning in, Abby. So as your talk showed, everyday people play an important role in amplifying influence, but they're not always highly visible. They're not all Taylor Swifts and Supreme Court justices. So Abby's curious about how we can identify these under-the-radar influencers in our organizations and in society more broadly.
Okay, great. Thanks for that question. You know, after we finished doing all of our work in middle schools, we held a big conference for all of the schools who had participated in the research. And they were very excited, and we showed them these positive results, and they seemed to like the program. And you know, then the teachers and the guidance counselors who came, they said, yeah, but we're not going to do that circle, dot, arrow survey thing that you did. Like, how can we find these students? And we said, well, we're really glad you asked, because you might remember that we did a survey with you. And indeed we did. So we surveyed all of the teachers at these schools at the beginning of the year when we did these interventions, and we asked them to predict who they thought would be the influential students. So does anyone want to guess like how much, like what percentage overlap there was between the students who were influential as identified by teachers versus by students? It wasn't zero. It was in the 20s. Okay, so there wasn't much overlap. And what we found was that teachers were more likely to identify students who were really good at interacting with adults. So these were students who reported things on their surveys like, I read for fun. I have an older sibling. All the kinds of things that like help students to interact really well with adults. And so adults thought well of these students and said, I bet they'll be great at influencing. And so what we tried to coach them on is exactly what I put up here. So who do you think your students are paying attention to? Let's ask this in a different way. And we kind of tricked them a little bit because we just asked them, like, who do you think will be influential? I think we could have reframed the question if we really wanted to see how good they were. We were really trying to go after this idea of, like, what do you think of as an influential person? But if we asked them, who are your students paying attention to, I think that their answers would have been different and more accurate. So in an organization, as you think about departments, who are people who seem to get a lot of attention? And it can even be negative attention, by the way, because some of the students who we picked as the influential students to participate in these anti-bullying programs, we would have to bring in the list of students who we were nominating to the principal's office and say, okay, we need to go home and get, parental permission for these students. And the principals would go through the list and say, okay, oh, not on your life. Absolutely not. Not for an anti-bullying. What? And we said, no. Even if you think that these students are causing some of this violence, right? They might be precisely the people who we need in this group, right? They're setting the standards. They're setting the social standards for the school. We need them involved in this too. And so I think those are the two things that really trip us up when we think about influence, is we try to think about the people who are standard deviations better than the rest of us, like moral exemplars. And what we need to think about is where the attention flows in our organizations and in our schools and communities.
So if you have a question, please just raise your hand and we'll bring a mic.
What do you think causes people to need someone to influence how they think and react to the world they're dealing with? Why do people follow what maybe mainstream would say, that's a crazy whatever, it's a bogus, whatever. Mm-hmm. Why do we need that? Mm-hmm. What causes me to go for that?
Mm-hmm. This is a very deep question, and there's an answer, I think, on an individual level and on a group level. So on the individual level, we have a very deep-seated need to understand the world by checking in with others. This is called epistemic social motivation. If you have a completely different idea about the world than everyone else, this is maybe one definition of how to go crazy, right? And so we have this just really basic need to understand the world by watching other people and how they interact with it. But I think what you're also pointing to is, how could you just go along with the majority if the majority are killing someone, or if the majority have decided that some people are worth nothing and that's not really your personal. And I think that has to do with the properties of our groups and our societies. When there is no space for people to dissent, for certain groups to be splinter groups and say, we don't believe in this, because you have strength in saying, I don't agree with anyone else, when there are people standing with you, right? If you're alone, you feel crazy. If you're with other people, you say, we, as a group, we know that there's a different reality, right? And so you need to share reality with other people, but if our societies, our communities don't allow for that kind of splintering and that kind of disagreement, that's when people are more silent. And so this is what some political scientists have studied in dictatorships and autocracies, where everyone is silent about how no one likes the czar, right? Because there's no space for it, right? Dissidents are killed, and you wouldn't think that there's a revolution brewing because no one's acting that way, right? It's all hidden underneath, and everybody's going along as if. And so that would be my answer, is that it's a property of who we are as humans. And then it's also a property of who we are as groups together.
I think we have time for one more question. We're running a little bit late, but we'll take one more. Chris?
Oh wow! Yeah, I thought it wasn't going to be me. So Betsy, fantastic talk. I was wondering, like, for some of those studies, I'm specifically thinking about the Bergefell study. and the next Supreme Court study, like, do you see any polarization, or is it really that people are just sort of updating their beliefs all in the same direction? Because especially, you know, for the abortion one, you can assume that there would be that type of polarization, right?
Yes. Let me talk about the abortion one, because that's where we really had a good enough sample. You know, over 5,000 people and a good representation of Republicans. Here's what's really fascinating to me is that we found polarization on every single outcome that we measured. So we also measured your perceptions of the court. Is the court legitimate, right? And it's the perfect figure showing a divergence. So the Democrats saying that the court is way less legitimate right after the leak, and then again right after the decision, and the Republicans saying the court is more legitimate. So we find lots of polarization. The only place where we don't find polarization is norms. We found it for attitudes, we found it for the way you feel about the US, the way you feel about the Supreme Court, different directions, except for what you think other Americans think.